This is the Kennedy detail, the White House detail as it looked in the spring to summer of 1962. This is Special Agent in Charge Jerry Bain, who I spoke to 3 times on September 27, 1992. He told me emphatically that President Kennedy never ordered the agents off the car. Again, he never ordered the agents off the car. He's now deceased. John Campion, Assistant Special Agent in Charge, also deceased. This is Floyd Boring, Assistant Special Agent in Charge, deceased in February 2008. He also told me that President Kennedy never ordered the agents off the car. 2 of the top agents of the White House detail both told me President Kennedy was a very nice man, very cooperative, never interfered with their actions, and never ordered them off the car. This is Assistant Special Agent in Charge Roy Kellerman, also deceased. His wife June told me that Roy never said that JFK was difficult to protect, and also said that Roy accepted that there was a conspiracy. Emory Roberts, who died in 1973, he was appointment secretary to LBJ. LBJ said that he greets me every morning and says goodbye to me every night. LBJ said that November 23rd, 1968. This is Stu Stout, also deceased. These 2 men were shift leaders. Actually, at the time, that he was a shift leader too, and he became Assistant Special Agent in Charge. Like I said, also deceased. Here's Jerry Blaine, infamously, of the Kennedy Detail book. Spoke to him a couple of times and corresponded with him. He also told me that President Kennedy never ordered the agents off the back of the car. There's Toby Chandler. He's on the Kennedy Detail documentary. I contacted him, but he never got back to me. Oh, by the way, I'm Facebook friends with Stu Stott's son and daughter-in-law. There's Walt Coughlin. Walt Coughlin also told me that JFK never ordered the agents off the back of the car. There's the late Bert DeFries. There's Bill Duncan. I contacted him, but he never got back to me. There's Bob Foster, now deceased, in charge of the Kitty Detail, JFK and Caroline. There's Tom Fridley. Ken Gianolis, spoke to him, but he didn't want to cooperate. There's the late Art Godfrey, shift leader, told me that President Kennedy never ordered the agents off the back of the car. Spoke to him 2 times and received a letter. Another top agent agrees with Bain and Boring. There's Dave Grant, who was Assistant Advanced Agent for the Dallas trip, and he's Clint Hill's brother-in-law. Yep, Clint Hill's brother-in-law, Dave Grant. There's Dennis Halterman, who's deceased. There's Clint Hill, come out with a book, Mrs. Kennedy and Me, in April 2012. I spoke to him, and I sent him a 22-page letter, which I'm convinced was the genesis of the Kennedy Detail, and indirectly, Mrs. Kennedy and Me, the follow-up. The need to write a follow-up, because the last one was a minor bestseller. This is the late Richard Johnson. I spoke to him briefly. This is Jim Johnson, still alive. There was an article about him, I think it was either last year or 2010. There's the late Charlie Kunkel, later guarded the Oswalds. Paul Landis, I spoke to him, didn't say anything really to me. There's Win Lawson, who I spoke to and received several letters. He also told me that President Kennedy never ordered the agents off the back of the car. That matter never came to his attention as such. There's Bob Lilly, spoke to him several times and received a letter from him. He also told me President Kennedy never ordered the agents off the back of the car. There's the late James Mike Mastrovito. I contacted him, but he never got back to me. I am on his blog that is still up. It has my 22-page letter to Clint Hill, which is also on my blog, too. There's the late Lynn Meredith. Like Bob Foster, he was in charge of the Kennedy kids, the Kitty Detail. He sent me a letter saying that the number one reason Kennedy was killed was no agents were on the back of the car, and he had no first-hand knowledge that President Kennedy did order the agents off the back of the car. There's Larry Newman, who I spoke to a couple times and corresponded with, and he told me that there was no directive per se from President Kennedy, that the agents were to be told to be off the back of the car, so he agreed with everybody else. I contacted him earlier this year, 2012, and he told me I'm crazier than a shithouse rat. He was really angry at me. There's the late, Ernie Olson's still kicking. Sorry about that, Ernie. I spoke to him briefly. He didn't want to cooperate. There's the late Muggsy O'Leary, who was JFK's Senate driver, and he was like an honorary. He became an agent, basically a name only. There's the late Bill Payne, who was a Kennedy detail in Austin. Kennedy was shot. There's Joe Palela. I received an email from him and a letter. There's Ron Pontius, who I received an email from, who tried to blame it on the staff, the reason why the agents were in the back of the car. In the interest of time, you can see my video on him and my articles. The staff had nothing to do with Kennedy, about the agents being off the back of the car. Dave Powers told me that the agents never had to be told to get off the back of the car. There's Jack Reddy. I spoke to him briefly, didn't want to cooperate. There's Paul Rundle, received an email. He was nice, but he didn't want to cooperate. There's Tony Sherman, received a letter from him. He basically believed the agents were told to get off the back of the car by Kennedy, but he had no first-hand knowledge. He directed me to Tim McIntyre, and Tim McIntyre told me he didn't remember who told the agents to get off the back of the car. There's Bill Skiles. There's Jack Warner, who later became basically the head of public affairs of the Secret Service. There's Ken Wiseman, who I received an email from, didn't want to cooperate. There's Milt Wildheight with a pretty bad hairdo there. There's Frank Yeager. I received a couple of letters from him. He says that he knew of no order directly from President Kennedy about agents being told to be off the back of the car. So he agreed with everybody else. Kennedy did not order the agents off the back of the car. There's the late Tom Shipman, died October 14th, 1963, up at Camp David of a heart attack. Could have drove Kennedy in Texas. There's Hank Ribka, who I mistakenly believed was the agent recalled at Love Field, but you can see my other videos in the interest of time. There's a valid reason why. His report seemed to indicate he was the agent, and he was indeed beside the car. He just isn't in the famous film. He dropped back by then, and it was Don Lawton who took his place. There's Wade Rodham, Wade Rodham, that's Hillary Rodham Clinton's uncle. Hillary Clinton, First Lady of the United States, that's her uncle, Wade Rodham. Protected Vice President Nixon in Caracas, Venezuela in 1958. Here's some of the Hyannisport agents. Keep in mind some of these became White House detail later. Tom Beale, Art Blake, Don Brett, Jim Cantrell, Frank Farnsworth, Bob Gaw, Winnie Gintz. I spoke to him briefly. He didn't want to cooperate. Jim Giovanetti, Jack Gleason, Jim Gooden. I've got a letter from him. He said President Kennedy was a very cooperative and pleasant person to work for. Mike Howard, still alive, still beating the drums for LBJ and the No Conspiracy people. There's Bob Jameson. Lem Johns, I spoke to him briefly. He said that he was not the agent on the Knoll, and he also told me he had no first-hand knowledge about President Kennedy, whether he did or did not order the agents off the car. Dick Metzinger, Gary Seal, Bill Sherlock, C.M. Solomon. I spoke to him. He told me that President Kennedy did not order the agents off the back of the car. There's Bob Till. And finally, Doc Walters. Keep in mind, this does not include Bill Greer and some other agents. I don't know why this is not 100% complete. This was done at President Kennedy's request. He wanted to have photographs with names of all the agents. This was done around the spring of 1962, maybe early summer. Thank you.